Why does the left focus on slavery, right? Well, because as the progressives tear down all that is great about America and our founding, they need to replace it with something, right? So what they do is they replace it with slavery, the worst thing. And they're saying that we should be defined by the evils of slavery and everything that even exists still today. That's why they are literally replacing the founding of our country from 1776 to the year 1619. That's the year they picked. New York Times has a whole thing called the 1619 Project. This is what they teach to kids in school, that our real founding was 1619. Why? That was the year that the first slave made it to America. This moment, this year, the progressives say defines who we are. What liars. Now, there's three interesting points of perspective that even on this, 1619. First, those slaves were enslaved in present-day Angola. How were they captured? They were captured by fellow Africans. Africans enslaved Africans, right? Asians enslaved Asia. Everyone enslaved everyone all the time. But Africans enslaved Africans and then brought them to the coast to sell them to the white man. That's the first point. Second, this ship with the slaves on it wasn't even originally sent to Jamestown in 1619. They were headed to present-day Veracruz, Mexico, which was a colony of Spain. They were headed to Mexico. But that's not surprising. Right? In the entire history of the slave trade to the New World, 300 years, 12.5 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. 10.7 million survived the journey. And how many of those 10.7 million made it to America? Only 388,000. That's it, out of the over 10 million. Most were sent to the Caribbean. Brazil got 5 million African slaves alone. So America was a slight fraction. We were 3% of the slave trade from Africa. 3% of the slaves from Africa were sent to America, that's it. Even these first slaves were sent to Mexico. But the ship was attacked just outside the port, the slaves were captured, and then they were sent up to Virginia. So point one, these people were enslaved by fellow Africans first. Second, they weren't even sent to America, they were sent to Mexico, captured along the way. And the third point is they weren't even slaves. They were indentured servants, which means they worked for a period of time and then they were freed at the end of their contract. Now you can nitpick over the slight difference and nuance there, but these slaves were eventually free men in the New World. So even the very premise of the 1619 Project that our kids are taught in school is missing incredibly valuable context. I want to quote Thomas Sowell here. He said, "Of all the tragic facts about the history of slavery, the most astounding to an American today is that although slavery was a worldwide institution for thousands of years, nowhere in the world was slavery a controversial issue prior to the 18th century. Nowhere else in the world except for here," as Tim was saying. So if you talk to pretty much any young person today, almost most people, but any young person today, they believe that America invented slavery. Truly, they believe that we invented it and that we are the only slave-owning country that ever existed. Kids truly believe that. And the reality is we need to celebrate this country as the country that ended slavery. 1775, the Quakers in Pennsylvania were the first society, the first community to end slavery. 1777, Vermont was the first government to officially outlaw slavery. Vermont! 1792, Denmark ended slavery, but it didn't take effect till 1803. 1811, Spain ended slavery. 1830, Sweden. 1814, the Netherlands. 1848 in France. They're gonna say, well, what about America? Well, I told you, like Vermont and some other colonies were already ending it, and as we talked about with Tim, some people tried to end it, but the king wouldn't let us. But what took America so long in the Western world? Well, it was one thing to end slavery, but the other question was, what do we do with all the slaves? And this slowed things up. Not to mention their entrenchment in the Southern economy, of course, too, right? But it was easier for a country to ban slaves when all their slaves were off in their colonies. But 20% of our population was slaves. But we fought a war over it. 2% of our population died answering this question. 1 American for every 6 slaves that were freed. 1 American was killed in the Civil War for every 6 slaves that were freed. It's a lot of lives lost to answer this question. But we were far from the last country to end slavery. The Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, they didn't end slavery till 1924, 59 years later. Saudi Arabia ended slavery in 1962. Oman ended it in 1970. Some countries didn't end it until the late 90s, and they're never criticized. It's only the Western world Only the Western world. Which is the only place in the world that started the intellectual and philosophical and religious and moral movement to end slavery, are painted as the originators of it. Absolute nonsense. I should note here as well, point of perspective, that we only think of the Atlantic slave trade, right? From slaves being taken from Africa going across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. We don't ever even think of the Arab slave trade, right? From Africa to the Middle East. Well, that slave trade started in the 9th century, hundreds of years before Europe started their African slave trade. The Arab slave trade lasted for 1,300 years. The European, or I should say the Atlantic slave trade, was only 300 years. So the Arab slave trade was another 1,000 years and way more brutal. 50% of the slaves that were brought from Africa to the Middle East died on the way. The greatest prize of this slave trade were the girls that were added to the harems of people in the Middle East. And you say, well, why are there no black people in the Middle East today? Because all the male slaves were castrated. Why is the Middle East never criticized for this? Only the Western world. Well, it was the Western world who got the Middle Eastern countries to stop their slave trade in the late 1900s. Amazing. 2 more points. Thomas Jefferson specifically gets criticized for owning slaves, but he never gets credit for ending the international slave trade. Tim touched on this a moment ago. When people on the left say that the Constitution, they say that slavery was entrenched in the Constitution. They don't tell you how. Yeah, it's in there. Slavery is in the Constitution. But the only time it's mentioned is when the Constitution says when it can be ended. Here's what I mean. Here's what it says in the Constitution. The migration or importation of such persons, slaves, as any of the states now existent shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. This was a compromise between the northern and the southern states in order to ratify the Constitution. So Thomas Jefferson became president. In 1806, he gave a message to Congress saying, we got to stop the international slave trade. 1807, Congress passed a law banning the importation of slaves, and it went into effect on January 1st, 1808, the very first day that it was constitutionally permitted. That's what the Constitution says, right? It shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. And when did Thomas Jefferson end it? January 1st, 1808. Thomas Jefferson did that. He ended the importation of slaves into America. And here we are today defining Jefferson as a slave owner himself, as opposed to the man who ended the international slave trade. Hey, Slater Crusaders, our latest special is about canceling our founding fathers. There is such a chasm now between us and our founding fathers, and that is, I believe, the source of why we are so disconnected from even this concept of liberty today. Where is the spirit of liberty? Well, you got to go back to our founding fathers and get it and be inspired by it. When we learn about these men in today's special, it is absolutely incredible. Please watch this special now on the First TV app. You can download it, thefirsttv.com.